Well, good morning, everybody. It's now 10 o'clock, so it's time for me to open this hearing session into the examination of the Maidstone Borough Local Plan Review. For those of you who've not attended previous sessions, just to introduce myself, my name's David Spencer, and I'm the Planning Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the plan, which the Council submitted in March of last year. Hopefully everybody's here this morning for sessions in relation to the proposed rural service centres and specifically the proposals for Coxheath, and then later this morning we'll discuss the proposals for Marden. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Yep, good. Can I please ask that people ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent settings, please? And can I ask of the council, are we due a fire test this today? And if the alarm goes off, what do we do?
Good morning, sir. No, we are not expecting the fire alarm to go off today. There are no scheduled tests. Therefore, if the fire alarm does sound, please leave this building down the stairs and out onto the square and await further instructions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, these sessions, as well as being held in this room, are also being recorded for those who wish to observe proceedings from home. So that is something that the Planning Inspectorate encourages, so it is going to happen. But to help the process, can those who are going to speak and participate, please use the microphones that are provided so that people at home can pick up and follow the discussion. In terms of the nature of the discussion, it will be informal but reasonably structured based on my previously issued matters, issues and questions and my hearing agendas that were recently published. What I'm here is obviously to assess the soundness of the submitted plan that was consulted on at Regulation 19 at the back end of 2021. I've obviously read people's statements and I've read relevant related representations on the submitted plan that you will have provided at the end of 2021. And what I'd like to reassure people is that whatever I have in writing carries equal weight to whatever I hear in the room today. In terms of those who can participate, it is just people round the table who have nameplates, who wish to exercise their right to be heard. I will try and bring you in on the discussion as we go along, but if there's a particular kind of key point you wish to make and you wish to come in at that moment, the convention is if you upend your nameplates, that'll signal to me to kind of bring you in, and I'll seek to do that at as soon as is conveniently possible. As I say, we're going to start this morning's discussion in relation to the plan's proposed approach for Coxheath. But before we do, for my benefit and for the benefit of those observing the recording, I'd perhaps just quickly like to go around the table for people to introduce themselves. And can I start with the council's team on my right, please?
Good morning, sir. Yes, it's Megan Thomas, King's Counsel, promoting the plan for Maidstone Planning Department.
Morning, sir. Phil Coyne, Interim Director for the Local Plan Review at Maidstone.
Good morning. Mark Edgerton, Strategic Planning Manager for Maidstone Borough Council.
Good morning, sir. Helen Smith, Principal Planning Officer for Maidstone Borough Council.
Sir Austin Mackey, Major Projects Team Leader for Site-Specific Matters.
Good morning, sir. Jason Lewis, Director of Transport Planning from Stantec on behalf of Maidstone Borough Council.
Thank you. If I go further around the table then, Mr.
Good
Osborne.
morning, sir. Guy Osborne from Country House Homes, a firm of local SME developers.
Morning, sir. It's Stephen Hinsley for Martin Davison White.
Morning, sir. Andrew Street, Concilium Town Planning Services, representing the landowner of Site 257.
Morning, Councillor Richard Webb from Coxheath Parish Council. Good morning, it's Julie Davis from CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity.
Thank you. So if we can please turn to my published agenda. I'd like to start this morning's discussion in relation to the overall approach for Coxheath that's set out at policy LPR SP6A. Coxheath is one of 6 identified rural service centres within the proposed spatial strategy for the plan. And my starting question is whether the policy that's set out at 6A provides a justified and effective approach in terms of the additional site-specific proposals in Coxheath and the infrastructure requirements that are identified over the plan period. If I can ask the council to start that discussion, and then I'll probably come to Mr. Webb from Coxheath, who I understand have issue about being identified as a rural service centre.
Thank you, sir. The inclusion of Coxheath as a rural service centre continues, and its allocation for site continues. So the site itself, the settlement itself, was included in the local plan 2017. So there is no precedent here, sir, in terms of the allocation of sites. Its inclusion as a rural service centre is in fact based around the settlement hierarchy. This has been subject to previous discussions, sir, in the stage 1 hearings where the merits of the settlement hierarchy were previously discussed. And we believe that we have been able to justify our approach in terms of that level of detail. We are mindful, however, of the fact that Coxheath has already been subject to growth through the local plan 2017. And so we are making sure that the level of growth which we are proposing through site allocations is kept to a minimum. We have been through our rigour, sir, and our processes with regard to the allocations. We have considered a strategic land availability assessment, which has been through a significant number of criteria in terms of assessing the sites which have been put forward and those sites which are suitable and capable for inclusion. They have been selected on the basis of the capacity, we believe, of Coxheath, and have also had regard to other evidence such as the sustainability appraisal. So we are in a position, sir, of bringing forward these what we'll call green sites, which have successfully met the criteria for inclusion. 3 allocations are put forward as part of this settlement. They are land at Forstall Lane, which is site 202. That is subject to main modification, sir, in terms of its inclusion, as well as 2 smaller sites as well. They are sites SA 251 and 364 within Coxheath itself. We say, sir, that those sites are entirely appropriate in terms of their location and their inclusion, and they give a reasonable degree of growth to Coxheath, which has the advantage of a fairly compact urban form and a significant number of key services and facilities. I've mentioned, sir, that there is the main modification in that regard, and there is also a second proposed modification associated with this policy regarding the improvements to health infrastructure. But other than that, sir, we commend the approach taken by the Council.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Edgerton. As I alluded to, I understand Mr. Webb, Coxheath Parish Council, you were previously, I think, a larger village, or in the larger village tier in the 2017 local plan, and that you have objection to being identified as a rural service centre. I don't know, I've obviously read your representations, but I don't know if there's anything in particular you wish to kind of bring to my attention.
Thank you. Yes, when we were at the 2017 local plan, our parish chairman came and argued against the rural service centre status there, and we were downgraded to a larger village. This time, when we are sort of as a rural we wish to be a larger village, because for rural service centres we do not have some of the infrastructure that would be supposed necessary for some of the rural service centres. We have just lost, excuse me, in Coxheath Parish, we have just lost our medical facility. That has actually moved now out of the parish. There has been a large central hub, I suppose you would say, or medical centre built in Linton Parish, which I always had the feeling, as an ex-borough councillor for what was Coxheath and Hunton ward, that covered the 5 villages of Coxheath, Hunton, Linton, East and West Farley. And when this first started to be developed, I was sort of looking at, are the planning department thinking Coxheath is the actual borough ward? Because the way it's sort of constructed, if you took the borough ward, the 5 villages together, then rural service centre could be. But Coxheath, as itself a parish, probably is not. It doesn't have a train station, doesn't have a medical centre, it doesn't have any public houses. As Mr. Edgerton sort of said, we have had 500 plus houses allocated in the local plan. Most or all of them have now been built, and places like the school have only had 1 extra class block put in there, so they are lacking facilities that they might need. The road structure has not been upgraded at all. Kent County Council have had monies from some of the, or all of these developments put forward to improve the Linton Crossroads site. Nothing has happened there. When I was a borough councillor, I was asking questions of county or Kent Highways to ask what was happening there. They said, we haven't got the money, we can't do anything. Yet we know there was meant to be money pushed there. So Heath Road becomes gridlocked most of the time, especially at the sort of the rush hour times, and not having anything sort of to mitigate those circumstances there. When the local plan or review first started, there were 3 sites that were not actually in Coxheath Parish, but were in the East Farley Parish. And once again, I say that was in the ward. So those 3 sites that went for public consultation probably would have been better, because they could have had more distribution for people to come and go through either the East Farley routes, through Coxheath, or through sort of the West Farley, Teeson routes and things like that. So really we're sort of saying the infrastructure in Coxheath, from when we argued against a rural service centre in the 2017 local plan, we've actually lost infrastructure, and therefore we cannot sort of sustain a rural service centre status for this time, due to everything that has counted against us, I suppose you'd say. And Mr. Edgerton sort of also talked about the brownfield site. We're not really sort of too upset about the brownfield sites, because they are there, and brownfield sites logically will be used. But when we try and then take some of the greenfield sites towards, especially what has been muted of all traffic coming up through to the village centre and then out through Linton Crossroads, once again we're putting more traffic on the Heath Road, which rumour sort of suggests is the busiest B road in Kent. So it certainly acts, if there's ever an accident on the M20, it acts as a southern bypass of Maidstone, because it has junctions at Leeds Castle and would go up to the what am I saying? Say the Aylesford junctions at the M20. So we notice when everything comes through, it comes through Coxheath, and there isn't the infrastructure for it, and we would not want this sort of status as a rural service centre. So.
Thank you. And Mr. Webb, Councillor Webb, in terms of, in your opinion, the kind of the difference between larger village status and rural service centre, I mean, is it the parish council's position, being a larger village, you would see less growth, or is it more sort of just a factual matter that you don't have the services or facilities that get you to that sort of rural service centre level?
We certainly have lost some facilities that would have been sort of pushing us for a rural service centre. As I say, we have no doctors in the village now. People have to leave the village to get there. When we sort of went, excuse me, when we went and looked at the plans, as I say, the original plans were for development outside of the parish and would have been in a separate, or 3 separate areas that would have been less of a mitigation for the traffic and things like that. So, yeah, we sort of do not think that with the services we have in the village, we would be able to act as a rural service centre for some of the surrounding communities.
And in terms of the medical facilities, which I think you described as being in Linton Parish, is that the Green Sands Medical Centre? Yep.
Yes, that's the one, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate we've kind of had an element of this discussion as part of stage 1. I don't know, from the council's perspective, obviously I've heard from the parish council's concern about what's happened in Coxheath. Is the borough council able to advise me, is there a positive side to being identified as a rural service centre in terms of potential future investment decisions, signalling to service providers that these are kind of particular hubs?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, so I mean, we appreciate the position, and I think it's fair to say that a number of the rural communities feel that the services and facilities that they experience could be better. That's why we've undertaken an objective assessment through our settlement hierarchy review to ensure that we are consistent in the approach which we're taking. And the reference here, so, is LPR 1.11, the settlement hierarchy review. There's a few areas in particular with that evidence, without getting too technical, that helps us to understand the position which Coxheath is in. Page 56 of that document, sir, does a nice comparator of Coxheath compared to other rural service centres as well. And, there are points which are legitimate within the parish council statements, absolutely. But I think what the borough council would say is that we have to look at 4 primary factors here: connectivity, the economy, scale and facilities. And when considering Coxheath amongst the other rural service centres, it performs comparatively to those other rural service centres from those 4 angles. And contrast that, sir, with what we find on page 57 of that evidence, where we start looking at the larger villages, that next tier down. We start to see then very significant gaps in some of those key factors. East Farley, in terms of its scale and facilities, and even economically, doesn't compare to Coxheath. Hollingbourne itself, very significant issues in terms of the overall economy, but is bolstered by connectivity and potentially scale as well. So there are gaps as we go further down the settlement hierarchy towards the larger villages. which are not apparent for Coxheath, notwithstanding some of the issues which have rightly been pointed out by Councillor Webb. I'd also refer to the annexes within, the first two annexes within that settlement hierarchy, sir. They provide an illustration of the level of services and facilities which are contained within that area. Coxheath also has quite a good urban form to complement those key services and support future population growth. Absolutely, it does not have a train station, but there is a bus service, and it connects into Maidstone town centre. And because it's also near the town centre, it has quite a lot of services and facilities which you can gain access to, as well as secondary schools and facilities. And so, yes, absolutely, we're in prime position with Coxheath to be able to bring forward contributions towards further services and infrastructure. We have to moderate the level of growth. Obviously, the more growth we provide into Coxheath, the more we are able to contribute to that infrastructure, but we have to take into account the fact that Coxheath has also witnessed expansion through the 2017 local plan, so we're trying to seek a balance in that regard, sir, but certainly it is the case that we would hope to ensure that future contributions will be made to services and facilities within Coxheath.
Thank you. And in terms of I think both Mr. Edgerton and Mr. Webb have both alluded to sort of recent kind of levels of development in Coxheath. Obviously, seeing the new housing that's been developed to the east, on the eastern side of the village, including at the end of, is it Forstall Lane? There's obviously a new housing development on the western side of the village, which I think was the 2017 local plan site. I think the council wants to make a factual change, I think, to recognise that that site has now been delivered. Is it site H159?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So in terms of the sort of the balance through the local plan review is 100 houses approximately over the three sites. Well, over three sites. I think there's relatively little comment in terms of the two smaller sites within the existing sort of built-up area of Coxheath. Will come on shortly to the principal site, but in terms of the policy itself, LPR SP6 for Coxheath, the council referred to, I think a moment ago, potential main modification in terms of a factual update on medical facilities. Is this to reflect what's happened in terms of the delivery of the green sands? Or am I getting confused?
No, that's absolutely correct, sir. So it's LPR SP6A. And two modifications are proposed. One in terms of sites, which we'll come on to obviously, but the second one is the amendment here to include to delete the extension of the improvement to the Orchard Medical Centre and Stockett Lane Surgery, which I understand is no longer needed because of the situation that you've alluded to there, sir.
Seems to me as a sort of effectively a factual kind of update that would be a minor change. It's not something I think I would need to recommend for plan soundness. In terms of that policy, LPR 6A, I think I'll bring in Mr. Osborne, who's done some maths or certainly some site area calculations. I think you're querying where the accessible natural semi-green space figure has been calculated, amongst other things, but I'll allow you to speak more widely on just the general policy approach to Coxheath, Mr. Osborne.
Thank you, sir. Yes, the 2B of the policy raised an eyebrow with me in regard to the 43.2 hectares of natural, semi-natural green space and how that can be delivered when one looks at the, and as you've alluded to, sir, in the representations that I've made in our hearing statement, that the parish has a total area of 235 hectares. 107 hectares of that is existing urban area, 49 hectares is existing woodlands, 55 hectares is existing farmland on the protected Greensand Ridge, and 27 hectares of the parish is protected by the Lewes Valley landscape of local value. There's an existing area of 7.5 hectares. That leaves 10.5 hectares. So I just felt that there was perhaps the council's alluding to enhancement of some existing green space, natural and semi-natural green space within the parish, or maybe it's alluding to the creation of more, but I think that just needs some clarity in the policy because it doesn't seem to stack up with the numbers.
Thank you. I'll allow the council to come back to that shortly. If I hear next from Mr. Street, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, the policy is Coxheath is comparable with other rural service centres within the village, within the borough. Coxheath has been spoken about for expansion, and certainly expansion westwards since 1974. There's been documents since 1974 circulated advocating expansion of Coxheath. My client's site, which was identified for housing development in the Reg 18B preferred options document, allowed for a bus turning facility to the west of Coxheath. As I said, it was included in the Regulation 18B document, along with Site Reference 202, as preferred options. The turning head itself was discussed extensively with KCC at the request of MBC, as it has to service the number 89 bus service, which is the bus service that connects Coxheath to Maidstone. And at the moment, there is no turning facility provision within Coxheath for the bus when it terminates at Coxheath to literally spin around and go back into Maidstone. The location of our site also caters for connections to a new venture bus service that serves Maidstone, Tovell and outlying villages. So our site is positioned in an ideal location for some form of bus interchange, as well as being acting as a termini. My client, who owns site 257, is prepared to gift the land as part of the planning process in order to improve transport infrastructure in Coxheath. And transport infrastructure is one of the key points raised in policy LPR SP6A. I'll come in later on the site specifics, sir.
Thank you for that. Mr. Hinsley next, please.
Thank you, sir. The council has quite rightly done quite a lot of detailed studies to look at whether or not Coxheath should be an RSC, and I think the findings of those studies is quite clear that it is suitable to be classed as an RSC. The comparisons with that Mr. Edgerton spoke about, the comparisons with the other RSC, I think it's quite clear that the range of facilities that that Coxheath has is something which elevates it to that status rather than a larger village. It's been mentioned that it doesn't have a railway station. Well, that's undeniably the case, but there are a number of decent bus services to Maidstone, and of course Maidstone isn't that far away and does have a number of other facilities that people can easily use from Coxheath. I think the third point I'd like to make is that it's quite clear that the council is taking a very measured approach to extra housing, and in that they are saying there has been some growth and we've got to limit further growth. And I think that is the right approach, and the policy, I think, indicates the level of growth that is suitable for Coxheath and its facilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Webb again, please.
Thank you. Just following up talk of the bus service. The buses used to go all the way through the village on the Heath Road and service all the way out to the west side to East Farley. And as has been mentioned, they then had problems turning around. What now happens is effectively it comes into the village, takes the first through road on the right, does a loop around that quarter of the village and comes back onto the Heath Road and things. So effectively, at the moment, only a quarter of the village is, I won't say near because we are quite compact, but is on the bus route. We do have to the opposite quarter, the southwest quarter of the village, would be an elderly residential area plus areas that would not be as likely to have vehicles and their own transport. So by sort of having the way the bus goes at the moment, it only covers this quarter. It's sort of the quarter that perhaps would have their own transport. If we did have facilities to go back and the bus companies have a chance to turn the buses again, we would also include the western half of the village, plus we would reinstate the link for people to just want to come in from East Farley to Coxheath. If we are sort of saying we are supposed to be the service, we need sort of connections. Therefore, New Venture did provide a bus service, but that, as was mentioned, came up from Maidstone through Tovall and down to Hunton. So we did lose the link of a bus service by having this lack of facilities for the buses to turn around, which other sites are obviously proposing to provide turning facilities.
So just so I'm clear, Councillor Webb, so in terms of current bus services, are they coming into the village from Heath Road, from the Linton Crossroads, along, and then as far as, if I call it the central crossroads within the village?
Yeah, that's right. They sort of come in, do a circuit around a road called Parkway, which is the first through road on the north side as you're coming in from Linton Crossroads, come out in Stockett Lane. They then have to try and get past Coxheath School on Stockett Lane, which at school turnout times is extremely difficult as well. And then they have to pull out of Stockett Lane at the Heath Road, West Hill Road junction, causing more problems because, of course, a bus needs a wide turn. So, yeah, when we lost the facilities to go straight through the village, it cut off not only the west side of the village with the buses, but also the link to Farley.
Thank you. If I can hear from others, I think Mr. Osborne next and then Mr. Hinsley.
Thank you. Yes, just picking up on a few of those points in regard to Site 257 and Councillor Webb's comments about those three sites that were within the Reg 18 version of the local plan. Those sites were outside of Coxheath Parish. They were actually in East Farley, which I believe Site 257 also is. And yes, it's correct, the bus service used to go through Coxheath. It did a little loop around Pembroke Road and ended up going into East Farley, where on the junction of Gallants Lane, where it would go down into and then form a U-turn in School Lane, which is some 400 or 500 metres down from the junction at Heath Road. Those sites were removed because in the transition from Reg 18 to Reg 19. I'm sure Mr. Mackey would be able to give further update on this, because they were deemed to be unsustainable locations, because they are distant from the centre of Coxheath in terms of walking distances, and there isn't any footpath continuously from Coxheath centre to Gallants Lane and East Farley. I believe also that the bus companies have found that the uptake on buses on that junction at East Farley wasn't great. But of course, Site 257 and its ability to be able to provide bus turning and to enable that continuation of bus services to East Farley could now come forward as part of an allocation within East Farley, given that East Farley's been upgraded as a larger village. And that wouldn't necessarily affect any discussion about Coxheath or its rural service centre standing, or indeed site allocations within Coxheath. So the valid point has been raised, but that should be pointed towards allocation of a site within the larger village. I know that the council has identified that 50 homes can come forward within that larger village at the back end of the local plan. But maybe that is something that should be considered for an earlier delivery in order to provide that bus facility that has validly been raised. The only other point I'd just like to point out is that the new medical hub at Greensands, Coxheath Medical Hub, which is, because of the compact form of Coxheath Parish, is actually within Linton Parish, but it's only 600 metres walking distance from the crossroads in Coxheath. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hear from Mr. Street, then Councillor Webb, and then we'll come back to the council.
Thank you. Just picking up on a point raised, 257 is a sustainable location. It was identified as a sustainable location in the SHLA. It was identified as a sustainable location in the preferred Regulation 18B document. It's the same distance, walking distance, equivalent to site 312, distance of approximately 900 metres. And it does have a footway linking the site to the centre of Coxheath.
Thank you. Councillor Webb, please.
That's exactly near enough the same points I was going to say. There has been a footpath from Gallants Lane to Coxheath for many years, though once you do get past Dean Street, it is effectively on the grass verge. It is still a footpath that is protected by bollards and is given status at the end of a proper crossing point to Gallants Lane. So yeah, I was going to say exactly that point, that there has been a footpath for many years. When the sites to the west came up in Reg 18, there was still a bus service going as well, so they would have been able to have the look of a bus service going along there. And just talking about the medical centre now being where it is, if you are, I should put this carefully, less able to walk, and you want to go, if you want to catch a bus, you then have to cross the road. If you wish to walk, you have, from the village centre, you have to cross, I think, about 4 or 5 different roads that come into Heath Road, and then you have to cross Heath Road itself, and there is no proper crossing facility. There are dropped curves, but there is no other way of crossing. There's no controlled crossing at this point. So you would then have to cross over to get into the doctors, and then cross over to get back to get on the north side of Heath Road, which has the continuous footpath. So yeah, near enough exactly what Mr. Street said, that we have a footpath from the west, and it's a long way to go to the medical centre on the east side.
Thank you. I'll give the council final sort of submissions. We're still on policy LPR SP6A, and there's kind of general approach to Coxheath, and then we'll move on to this site specifics. So is it Mr. Coyne first or Mr.
Thank you,
Edgerton?
sir. I think Mr. Edgerton's going to come in on the general topic of buses, but just to add, my recollection on site 257 at Reg 18 stage was that there was a conversation between the council's DM team and the bus company, and that there wasn't really an appetite for the turning head that was being talked about at that time.
Thank you, sir. Yes, that is my recollection. Those sites could have presented opportunity, but there was a significant bus dependency, and the council has reverted to sites which are adjacent to the Coxheath settlement boundary now. In terms of the open space situation, the figures we've generated take into account open space deficiencies for each area, and you'll see comparative figures for the other rural service centres, for example, sir. I'll hand over to Mr. Mackey in that regard, but we do appreciate that some of the requirements are quite significant in terms of existing deficiencies, and we will work with developers to help meet to as far to a greater extent as possible those deficiencies. They are not sort of fait accompli requirements, and from the developments which are proposed, we are aware that we are seeking to limit the amount of development in these locations. But I'll hand over to Mr. Mackey just to provide a little bit of extra detail.
Thank you, sir. Just to confirm on the bus matter, I can confirm that both ourselves and KCC pressed the operator for clarity on what they sought or what they would support. Nothing was forthcoming from the operator. So in the absence of any clear public transport benefit, we felt that was outweighed by the site's relative distance from the heart of the village and the characteristic of the pedestrian connections. On open space, sir, it's from Reg 18A and through Reg 18B, we started to look at each of the sub-growth locations, the parts of the urban area, the villages, the objective being to identify where there were shortfalls by typology in open space to assess whether potential site allocations could not only wash their own face but contribute towards meeting deficits in an area. So in other words, help contribute to improving the sustainability and quality of places. We were able to get clear village figures for example, villages such as Coxheath, because they have a clearly defined catchment. It was far more difficult to do that for the sites on the edge of the urban area because of the overlap and different directions and travel. For that reason, we left the figures in, and of course it would be for any planning application to demonstrate that it might contribute towards those deficits in terms of giving weight to that consideration. But between Reg 18 and 19, we moved away from specifically demanding that sites meet that deficit. But as you know from previous discussions on Pested Bars and Abbeygate Place, there are sites where that is being achieved. But in Coxheath, it was felt that we were better to leave the deficit and allow that as a material consideration for any subsequent planning applications.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the site specifics, but I'll give Mr. Street sort of one last opportunity on this. Obviously, your site is not in the plan, so it's not something I'm technically examining. But I'll allow you to make a further point.
Yeah, just want to pick up on a point that's been raised. Between February 2021 and April 2021, I had 4 meetings with KCC. Now, they were Teams meetings because we were in a pandemic at that point in time, but there was certainly interest in having a bus turning head on our side. That was being driven by Stagecoach. I subsequently had a conversation with another bus operator who also expressed an interest in it. And the plan that we put back to Maidstone Borough Council on the 7th of April was a result of discussions that we had with KCC on the size and the facilities to be incorporated within that bus terminal. And a lot of work went into that exercise.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to look at the specific site proposals for Coxheath. I want to start the discussion by saying, obviously, what I have before me is the Regulation 19 plan. It's the plan that the Council consulted on as the plan it intended to submit for examination, a plan it considered could be found sound in that form. And it clearly identified a single large allocation to the east of the village, site 312, with an accompanying policy. And my, I think, overarching question for this part of the discussion is, why is it now necessary for plan soundness for me to arrive at a recommendation to delete site 312 and replace it with site 202, given the council consulted on this as what it considered to be a sound plan and proposal? What's the new evidence? What's changed to prompt the proposed main modification?
Thank you, sir. Yes, we did indeed recommend this site for inclusion as part of the Regulation 19 documents, and it was consulted on in that regard. When we got to the stage of considering main modifications to the plan and the representations, for example, we were mindful of the views that were taken by our elected members, sir. They decided that this was not something which they could support. I think the degree of opposition was quite significant. We also have and are aware that there are a number of parish councils as well who believe the development would be detrimental to the area. So a significant number of borough councillors reached the view that this development would not be good at all for Coxheath. The primary concern, I think, alludes to the issue of coalescence between Coxheath and Lewes. Officers had recommended that a buffer be put in place, but simply, sir, that buffer is not considered to be sufficient and suitable for ensuring that coalescence doesn't take place. So the coalescence impact, would effectively help Coxheath become almost like a southern suburb, I think, of Maidstone urban area, and erodes its distinctiveness, Coxheath's distinctiveness in that regard. So for those reasons, sir, there was a clear vote to include the main modification, the swap from site 312 to 202. I will qualify this in one other respect, and I think it's, we're here in a technical environment, sir. The strategic land availability assessment has been consistent, and we've been testing that throughout these hearings. I have to say, sir, that from that point of view, the sites are comparable, and I think it would be remiss of me, sir, to try and allude otherwise. So we have two comparable sites here in terms of 202 and 312, and for the reasons I've provided, the local planning authority has put forward the main modification and commends it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Coyne.
Just to emphasise what Mr. Edgerton has said, the sort of political unanimity around this included 4 parish councils and I think all 6 borough councillors, so there was a high degree of political concern around the scope for coalescence here.
Thank you. I mean, obviously there are other sites in this plan. I've heard from other borough councillors, parish councillors who don't like sites or object to sites that are in that were put forward in the Regulation 19 plan, and the council is not determined to alter or change those. In terms of the coalescence issue, and the basis, I'm going to, as this is the council's proposed main modification, but the council advised me where I should be kind of assessing the coalescence issue, where they consider the harm would potentially arise, reflecting what was raised in the Regulation 19 representations. I mean, I appreciate on that part of Heath Roads, obviously the alluded to earlier, the Green Sands Medical Centre has now been delivered. Mr. Edgerton.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I think the issue here is the encroachment over to the east, and you know, whilst we were able to put forward a scheme which included a buffer, I believe it was a 15-metre buffer on the eastern side of the site, it's felt that even with that, there would not be a sort of sufficient gap between Coxheath and Lewes, resulting in that coalescence issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And in terms of, obviously there is a process to plan making. Members would have presumably have been previously involved and would have had to have made a decision on the content of the Regulation 19 plan, the proposed submitted plan that included Site 312. My reading through the background is that there were changes that previous other sites were considered and contemplated, and I appreciate what Mr. Edgerton's telling me in terms of, matters are balanced in terms of what's in the SHLA evidence. But it seems to me sites were originally considered in Coxheath, taken out. This site was put in. I've looked at the coalescence issue. I'll look again after this discussion and what I've heard, but it's needing to be persuaded that I can make a recommendation that the site 312 is unsound and needs to be removed and a new site put in. I mean, if I was in the position where I couldn't arrive at that conclusion and site 312 was, I mean, it's the submitted plan, it's the submitted policy, were to remain, would that in itself require further modification? As you say, it includes a requirement for obviously landscaping and buffering.
I think so. We have to revert to the strategic land availability assessment in this regard. You will be able to make your own conclusions, but I have alluded to the fact that these sites have scored very similarly in terms of our objective assessments. Indeed, I can't undermine the overall plan by saying that Site 312 does not achieve green status by ensuring that it is meeting the relevant criteria within the land availability assessment and sustainability appraisal. And I would just emphasise the very significant concern from Maidstone politicians and committees and other organisations in regard to this site and the coalescence issue. However, I cannot say that this site is unsound. I can say that the site itself fully meets the criteria along with the other site, indeed, site 202, which also meets the criteria.
Thank you, Mr.
I think
Coyne.
what Mr. Edgerton has said is correct, sir. And in terms of your comment about the process, obviously there was the process, and as it turned out, the real concern sort of about this site emerged post Regulation 19. But what you say about the process is correct, and that there is, and I completely agree, there are other sites that we've had elected members come to these hearings and say they don't agree with. I think this is one that we looked at sort of a main modification for because of the level of unanimity around it. But as Mr. Edgerton said, that the technical work is the technical work, sir.
And in terms of just the issue of sort of coalescence and sort of wider landscape, is site 312 in the local landscape value area?
It is not within the landscape of local value area, sir.
Thank you. Perhaps if I can bring in others. I'm going to start with Mr. Osborne. As I say, we're starting from a position of the submitted plan, or the plan that was consulted on for submission included site 312. That's in the version of the plan before me. I'm not aware there was any consultation post another Reg 19 that followed, like Reg 19 Part 2. So what is being put forward to me is a new proposed main modification. So as far as I'm concerned, the plan I'm examining includes site 312. There's a recommendation for a change, and I want to understand whether that's necessary for soundness and whether site 312 is unsound. Mr. Osborne.
Thank you. Obviously, as the promoter of Site 312 and somebody who's looking to bring forward the scheme, we believe that it is sound and that there are no key issues with regard to the scheme. I approached Mr. Edgerton shortly after the adoption of the 2017 local plan, before the ink was dry on it, to start discussing the local plan review, and came forward with Site 312 and a number of other schemes to start that process. It was made very clear to me at that time that the call for sites for the local plan review was going to raise the bar, and that we were going to have to demonstrate fully delivery and suitability of our sites when bringing them forward, and that we wouldn't be able to just come forward with a red edge around a boundary, and that we would need to bring forward something that were akin to an outline application. I took that earnestly and seriously, and we went away and we started to prepare the scheme. And we have submitted to the council copies of every single report that we've had carried out, LVIAs, ecology, landscape, transport, minerals, everything that one can think of to support the scheme, along with an outline layout of the scheme which provides a 20-metre wide landscape buffer covering a 3.3 hectare area abutting the parish boundary between Coxheath and Lewes. The coalescence point has been something that has been on our minds, and so that's why we've designed in that 20-metre wide landscape buffer. One of the principal concerns about development in Coxheath is development in locations which would encourage rat running on rural roads that lead north. I grew up in Coxheath. I lived opposite the village hall. I know for a fact that it's very easy to jump in the car and drive up Stockett Lane and go through Tovell to get to Maidstone Town Centre. You dodge all of the traffic. That's the easiest way to get into the town if you live in the Stockett Lane area. Therefore, it's essential that development in Coxheath of the scale of 85 homes is located somewhere where that traffic can easily access the main arterial roads via Linton Crossroads. And of course our scheme can come forward and provide the contributions towards the upgrading of those crossroads so that we can alleviate the problems that Councillor Webb outlined earlier. In short, we are ready to come forward. It's deliverable. It can come forward at the earliest opportunity. The scheme's fully prepared, and there's no doubt that Beacon Park is the right site for Coxheath and that it is sound. In picking up on the point that Mr. Edgerton has made about comparables to Site 202, and in looking at the policy wording for the proposed modification to select Site 202 that's contained in document LPR SUB 011, it sets out some parameters there that it's requiring from Site 202. Which includes 1.5 hectares of accessible open space. It wants the density to be appropriate to the fringe of village setting. It wants the development to set back from the highways of Forstall Lane and Stockett Lane, and it wants to have a landscape buffer around its perimeter to try and mitigate the harm that would occur on the Lewes Valley landscape of local value. Taking a reasonable assessment, that would sterilise, along with trees that one would want to retain on site, that would potentially sterilise an area of about 1.8 hectares for Site 202. We've seen confirmation through the hearing statements from the agent representing the scheme that the site area is only 3.6 hectares and that's being reduced because they can't come forward with any more than 3.6 hectares. Just doing the simple maths, if you deduct 1.8 from 3.6, that leaves you with 1.8 as a developable area. There is no way that you can get 85 homes on a 1.8 hectare site if you're going with a density that is suitable for the fringe of settlement area, particularly within a local landscape value where you want green space to be fingering into your scheme to mitigate the harm from it. So, Site 202 can't deliver the 85 homes. In addition to that, the policy wording within the main modification requires that the site provides pedestrian connectivity to PROW KM 49. A cursory look at land registry will identify to you that the site is isolated from KM 49 and that there is another landowner who owns land called Primrose Paddock, who is separate from the landowner of Site 202, owns a sizable chunk of land between that and KM 49. So that's part of that policy cannot be adhered to. We should also take into account the fact that Maidstone Borough Council, since the Stage 1 hearings, has refused a planning application for 9 self-build homes on land to the west of Site 202, and the officer determined here that dwellings here, whatever the scale, design and layout, would erode the open feel of the site and would harmfully consolidate sporadic development in the area, resulting in harm to the character and appearance of the countryside hereabouts that falls within the locally sensitive Lewes Valley landscape of local value. We also have a site to the east, where an appeal inspector to land at Linden Farm determined the harm that I have found here would be long-lasting and worthy of significant weight, which would lead to conflict with paragraph 130 of the framework, which amongst other things seeks to ensure that new development is sympathetic to the local character. That site has since been granted a planning approval for just 2 homes because that was considered to be appropriate on that fringe of settlement. The key reason why Site 202 was removed after Reg 18 was two factors. One was because of the concerns of transport impacting the rural roads leading north. And when one considers that we have Linton Crossroads, and as others have commented here already, that is awaiting financial contributions so that it can be upgraded and provide the ease of transport through the junction that's required. A good transport assessment, and I've consulted with our transport consultants on this matter, if they were advising me on site 202, they would have discussions with the KCC Highways Authority and explore with them how there would be a dispersal of transport leaving site 202, and that would then lessen the amount of weight of traffic that might go through Linton Crossroads, which of course would lessen the financial contribution towards the upgrade. So if we're now in this position of having a beauty parade, and we're being told that the two sites are comparable, we have site 312 Beacon Park, which can comply with and exceed the policy requirements that have been set down within it. And we have site 202, which is no longer of the scale suitable to be able to provide 85 homes and is really struggling to meet with any of the policy criteria laid down within the main modification. So my conclusion, sir, is that site 312 is the most sound selection for Coxheath. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. If I hear next from Councillor Webb and then Mr. Hinsley.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of pick up that, as Mr. Edgerton and Mr. Coyne said, I was at the time still a borough councillor, and yes, we all agreed that this site of 312 was not the correct site. We had parish council support, we had everyone sort of concerned with it. Politically was united that we did not feel this site was the right site for the coalescence, the traffic that goes through the Linton Crossroads. And just to pick up on what Mr. Osborne has sort of just now said, when we were consulted as a parish council on the Forstall Mead site, which is just to the south of Forstall Lane, that is now being built, Kent Highways actually said that all traffic would go along Stockett Lane, along Forstall Lane, up Stockett Lane to the centre of the village, and then out through Linton Crossroads. So anything at Forstall Farm, they would probably say the same thing, because they would therefore be contradicting what they've said in previous planning application. So I would still sort of say that there should be mitigation from this Forstall farm site, would still contribute to Linton Crossroads. One thing that we need to sort of say is the site of 312 is rather larger than the site that has been built to the west of it, which forms the eastern edge of Coxheath at the moment. With all the other developments, or two other developments supposed for Coxheath, and we have a total of 100 houses in the review to be allocated to Coxheath. 85 houses on this site. Parish Council has raised concerns that this site is too large for 85, and that if it went ahead, we would end up with more, double more houses on this site than is proposed at the 85. So that's why they would support, or prefer, should I say, the Forstall Lane site, because it is the smaller nature. It would not lead to more than allocation houses, and although I have been told to say, once again, we would still prefer out of village. Once again, going back to the original, when we had the regulation 18, those were rejected. Site 312 was put in at Reg 19, and then we want to reject this one. So really, the people of Coxheath would prefer out of village, and perhaps going back to what I said earlier about in the ward of Coxheath and Hunton, to have the development elsewhere would lessen the impact on all the roads because they would be smaller sites. Now, as you've said, you're not here to look at that, but Coxheath Parish Council would still prefer other sites considered rather than both of these. But when we look at the worth of unsoundness, because of where Site 312 is and the traffic that goes along Heath Road, as I say, it's reported to be one of the busiest B roads in the county. Anything that is therefore coming out onto that site, and now with it being close to where the new medical centre has been built, we're effectively forming a new crossroads, staggered crossroads at that site, which will cause more problems of either cars turning into development or out of the development and on a westerly direction into Coxheath, because they will have to fight across the traffic. However Linton Crossroads is improved, there will always be the traffic backlog because this site is so close to the Linton Crossroads site, and it will always cause problems that we feel as a parish council prove unsoundness on the traffic infrastructure, as well as all the other things, talking about the coalescence and everything that has been said before. That's what I'll leave at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Evers. I sort of asked of the council, I mean, on this issue of coalescence, is there any sort of particular aspect or location you would like me to have in mind, or when I go back to look again at this issue and go out on site to look again, that you where you fear the kind of the coalescence risk arises from? Is it on the Heath Road, or is it wider than that?
It's loses to the north of this site, and in fact, actually, from what I understand of the planning application that's just gone in, Mr. Osborne talked about the 9 homes that were rejected from site. That is actually opposite the northwest corner of site 312, is right opposite where these 9 homes were rejected. But in that Forstall Lane, Well Street corner, as I say, on the northwest part of it, and then going along the footpath that comes out in Linton Road, Lewes, that is the concern we have, that the northeast, north and the east side boundaries are all right next door to Lewes Parish Council, and even call for sites were actually on the other side, on the Lewes boundary. So we would be concerned in any more review of local plan submissions and things, that would come up again, and therefore we are just progressing along to build that the parishes will be touching, or built up parts of the parish will therefore be touching, rather than any farmland that is there now and provides the sort of barrier that is quite nice and wide and is productive for the fruit.
Thank you. Mr. Hinsley, please. As I say, the 2 dimensions to this is the site was put forward at Regulation 19, site 312, is that unsound? Does it need to be modified? Does there need to be a modification? And I'm sure you'll tell me the modification should be site 202. But I hear what you have to say on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I can very easily answer your first point that 312 is not a sound site. We've heard from the parish council on matters of coalescence. It's quite clearly in a gap that was protected for a number of years. It does take development much, much closer towards the Borton Green area of Luce. It's quite...
Sorry, Mr. When you say it was protected, what, there was a strategic gap policy, or...?
It was previously protected for a number of years as a gap.
Right.
It's a site which has many differences to 202. I heard what Mr. Edgerton said, that they are comparable, 202 and 312. They clearly are not comparable sites. 312 is much larger. It's nearly 3 times larger than 202. 202 is a more sustainable location in terms of particularly the school and its close proximity to the school. Probably, I think it's probably about half a kilometre from the school, whereas I think the 312 site is about 1.5 kilometres. It's a much more sustainable location when it comes to the ability for people to take their children to school and walk them to school. 202 is also in an area where there has been development. There's development to the north, there's a series of developments, and it can be plainly seen that it is an infill gap. The other difference is that the site is low-key agricultural land. It's unkempt, whereas we have at 312 an orchard, quite an extensive orchard. I think the parish council's concerns that the site 312 would end up being far larger than the 85 needed. I think that is something that is probably going to happen when we get to planning application stage. That's almost certain to happen in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. What would you say, Mr. Hinsley, to the point made by Mr. Osborne that when you read the proposed policy requirements for Site 202 and you look at potential net developable areas, he raises obviously questions over the deliverability of 85 units, bearing in mind you've also put forward a plan as part of your statement indicating a further sort of reduced sort of site area.
Yes, I did put forward a different site area, and that reflects the reason for that is to protect other uses, in particular the gypsy and traveller pitches, which we all know, and we'll be talking about later, we all know the huge need for gypsy and traveller pitches. So we need to protect those pitches. That's the reason why there's a slight modification on the area. In terms of the objectives behind the main modification policy, I don't see any reason why they cannot be sustained within a development of the site. I don't share Mr. Osborne's concerns about that, about the reduced level and the impact that buffers, etc. would have.
Thank you. So in terms of if there were to be a proposed main modification, I'm not saying there will be, that one that I can recommend. Site 202, you say the capacity at 85 is still reasonable and deliverable?
Yes, it is.
With your amended site plan?
Yes.
Yep. Thank you. Ms Davis, please, for CPRE Kent.
Thank you. As one of the other parties that objected to this allocation, we were obviously quite pleased to see that it was going to be deleted, and specifically want to support the parish council and their views they've already expressed about the coalescence and where best to appreciate that from. But it does really bring me back to our points we've made earlier on in the sessions about our underlying density issues. And of course, if the densities were increased in the Maidstone urban sites, it may well be that sites like this wouldn't need to be lost, greenfield sites lost to development. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Osborne, please.
Thank you, sir. Just going back to the points about coalescence. Coalescence is two urban areas meeting each other, as you well know. This isn't a proposal that results in two urban areas of two separate settlements meeting each other. Currently, we have green space meeting green space. The proposal, if carried forward, and if further modification is required to the policies set out within the submitted LPR to provide further certainty on the degree of green space that we would provide within our local nature reserve that we've proposed within our scheme, that could be provided to ensure that that green space is located along that parish boundary to maintain that separation, because you would then still have green space meeting green space. One thing that should not be forgotten here is that if the modification to remove site 312 carries forward and 202 supplants it, site 202 coalesces with the parish of East Farley. And as you'll have seen from the written representation that I've made on the statement hearing, on our hearing statement, sorry, I beg your pardon, I've included a map there showing the parish boundaries, showing the site locations, and showing how site 202, located within the Lewes LIV, is right up against East Farley parish boundary. So, you know, baked, boiled or fried, there's going to be a site that is going to be hard up against a parish boundary. It's a case of then picking which is the best one by virtue of the scale, the positioning, the transport movements, the access to services. Site 312 has that access directly onto the Heath Road, where transport movements would be encouraged to stay on the main arterial roads. It's positioned between the village and the secondary school. It's got bus stops right outside of it. It provides a pedestrian crossing across to the medical hub. There are many benefits that come forward with that scheme. Yes, the site is of a larger scale. At the moment, we are adhering to the sentiment of coming forward with 85 units as per the draft policy. But of course, if there's any slippage anywhere else within the local plan where other sites may have been deemed to need to lessen their capacity because they can't deliver that capacity for whatever reason, site 312 can offer additional housing to take up that slack. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate, because of what's before me, the council hasn't proposed any modifications to the policy for site 312 other than its deletion. Obviously, I'll reflect on what I've heard this morning, revisit the location in terms of what I've heard. But if I was in a position where I am saying to the council, this is something I cannot recommend for soundness, in terms of the principle of removing site 312, but there may be further detail required within the policy in relation to the location or the amount of kind of green space, buffering. That may be a direction that I would encourage the council potentially to consider. Alternatively, if I do find myself in a position where I feel I can recommend the proposed main modification and include site 202, I note the Kent County Council, as part of their representations, I think seek some further content in relation to highway infrastructure. I think they want the policy to refer to mitigation to the A229 Linton Crossroads, which we've heard about this morning. I'm not inviting the council to give an immediate view or response to that, but that's something that could flow from that. And additionally, the council will have seen the statement from Mr. Hinsley in terms of a reduced site area. I don't know if the council has any sort of immediate view or response to that proposal in terms of necessity for potentially finding site 202 sound.
Thank you, sir. Yes, in terms of site 312, then obviously were you to proceed with that site allocation, we as an authority would want the coalescence matter maximised, the ability to minimise the impact of any coalescence minimised, and the degree of buffering along the boundaries, eastern boundaries and potentially northeastern boundaries maximised. With regard to site 202, yes, we are aware that Kent County Council have put in their representations. We will be happy to work with Kent County Council to ensure that relevant mitigations, including any relevant impacts on Linton Crossroads, are considered. We would also like to consider the revised site boundary. We'd be happy to consider those amendments to ensure that the site was clearly defined and did not impact on the provision for gypsies and travellers, as has been mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably coming up to a point for a mid-morning adjournment, after which we'll look at Marden. Are there any further or final points people wish to raise in relation to Coxheath? I think what I'm saying in relation to the site specifics is, the reasons for a main modification. I need to be satisfied that they are required to meet a test of soundness, and that's going to be sort of forethought in my post hearings advice for stage 2 from the council as to whether this is something I can recommend and whether the planner submitted in this regard was already sound.
Would it assist, sir, if on an absolutely non-prejudicial basis the council were to discuss the boundary of sites 202 with Mr. Hinsley and provide you with a boundary that we agree for your deliberations?
I mean, obviously, I've got the submissions from Mr. Hinsley. I think if the council wants to look at that further and provide a note or submission to me on the revised boundaries, that's something I'll take a look at. I appreciate it is not the council's current proposed modification, but I'm thinking from sort of an aspect of kind of fairness and equitableness, if a similar courtesy should be extended to Mr. Osborne in terms of whether there's further modifications to site 312 in terms of potentially strengthening, referencing to landscaping and open space provision. So perhaps if the council can do me a note, kind of a post-Coxheath note, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, we'll now take an adjournment, a mid-morning adjournment. If I go by the clock in this room, if we could be back here, please, for 11:45, And then anybody who's patiently waited for Marden, my appreciation, and we'll discuss Marden after the break. Thank you. Okay, it's just gone 11:45 by the clock in this room, so I'm going to resume this hearing session. I think looking in the room, I think everybody was here when I made my initial announcements this morning, so I'm not going to reintroduce myself or go through the procedure. Just again, just a reminder, obviously we are recording these events, so participants around the table, please use the microphones when making points to me. And I think it's still the same council's team for this session as was for Coxheath. So hopefully everybody's here for Marden. I think in contrast to Coxheath, I don't think there's any sort of in principle issue about Marden being identified as a rural service centre as a continuation from the 2017 local plan. But similar to the other rural service centres, the plan sets out a policy at LPR SP6E for Marden in terms of the general sort of overall approach to managing development at this settlement. And my question in terms of my agenda for the council in terms of its approach to Marden, whether policy LPR SP6E will provide a justified and effective approach, and sort of more widely in terms of your SLA and sustainability appraisal process, that the plan has alighted on an appropriate allocation for additional housing.
Thank you, sir. Yes, so Marden itself, as you say, is well established in terms of its potential for development. It holds a number of facilities and services and appropriate infrastructure, including a rail station as well. It scored very highly indeed as a rural service centre in terms of connectivity, the economy, scale and facilities in terms of the settlement hierarchy. The principle of growth within Marden is not new. The 2017 plans allocated sites within it, including H146. The site which is being proposed is actually next door to that site, SA295. And overall, so we've done a robust set of evidence documents to support the inclusion of Marden and this site within it. I would say, sir, that we are aware of the level of growth which has been contained as part of the 2017 plan, and that is why we are restricting the amount of growth in Marden itself to this site, to ensure that there's a sense of proportionality and we focus growth to other locations. We do have a few main modifications which you will see in sub 011, but otherwise we'd commend this overall approach to you.
Thank you. Just looking at what's put forward in document sub 011, the first proposed change is to is to include a reference to cycle access as well as pedestrian access. I think that seems a fairly sort of straightforward change. I think it's not something I would necessarily need to recommend for soundness, so I think that's a change the council can do. You've also removed a reference to site 314. Was that a previous consideration or a typographical issue?
So in the original call for sites, there were two sites submitted, 295 and 314, and subsequently by Reg 19 they've actually been joined together as one site under the 295 umbrella.
Thank you. Again, if that's a factual kind of update, again, that's a minor modification. I think similarly, if the primary school is now a primary academy, again, if that's a factual update, that's minor. Where things may move into more sort of main modification territory, and I know Ryden Homes have made, or is it Ryden Homes? Ryden Homes have made submissions on this. I think this has been raised, it's either Natural England or is it the Environment Agency, one of those two bodies, in terms of additional policy context in terms of development not having an adverse effect on the river. This will test my local pronunciation. Is it Bolt? Belt? You can tell I'm out of town from out of town. The river Belt. And will support the conservation objectives of the action plan. And I'd just like to hear from the council in the first instance of why that may be necessary to include. I know it's been included for other settlements. The council's view on including this as a proposed main modification.
Yes, thank you, sir. This is just a consistency issue for the council to ensure that the consideration has been given. We are appreciative of the distance to the river belt from this particular development, but we wanted to make sure that the overall impact on the SSSI, there wasn't any significant impact on the SSSI and any mitigations were put in place. We hope that it doesn't cause the developer any sort of issues, but it has resulted from, I believe, from a representation from the Environment Agency, and we wanted to be consistent across the areas where we have asked for these criteria at their request.
Thank you. I understand on behalf of Raiden Homes, I think a query about the necessity for this and its kind of its practical kind of consequences.
Yes, sir. Thank you. That's precisely the point which we've made in our representations, and beyond that, we're some nearly 4 kilometres away from the river, and we don't see there being any impact. So, in a sense, having the criterion in there is not going to be a significant issue for us, but we don't really think it's necessary because it's outside. It's 3.9 kilometres away, but also it's our view. It's having looked at it, it's outside of the catchment actually, and when you go back to looking at what the Environment Agency or Natural England put forward when they looked at the local plan initially, they said that 3 settlements should be have this criterion included, and Marden was not one of those. But latterly, they seem to have included Marden, but we can only think that that's actually an error rather than something that's actually required. So, our view is that it's not necessary to refer to the river belt SSSI.
Thank you. I mean, in terms of the just thinking about the scope and the extent of policy LPRSP6. I mean, just technically, does the parish of Marden extend as far as the river belt? Sort of looking at the figure on page 84 of the submitted plan that shows kind of the overall kind of context map for the proposed sites in Marden. Is the river is the river belt one of the two? Is that the kind of the main water course to sort of the south of the village?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
I'm just wondering. I'm not here to advocate for the Environment Agency, but I'm just wondering in terms of just general overarching approach, it may not have an implication specifically for you for the proposed site allocation, but I'm just wondering whether the Environment Agency is taking a more holistic view, whether to be other windfall or other development within Marden. This is something where this could be an issue. Mr. Edgerton.
As I say, so our intention here is just, we received the representations. We wanted to ensure that there was consistency as a result of those representations from the Environment Agency. You could see the proximity of the belt to Marden itself. It isn't obviously just this particular site. There is the potential for windfall development within Marden. I would commend that amendment to you, sir. we're pleased with the level of engagement which we received from the Environment Agency, and we felt it fair to reflect that. There are other policies which we have also proposed the amendment in light of their representations.
Thank you. And in terms of just the general overarching approach to Marden and looking at the policy itself, we'll be looking at employment policies later on in the final week of this plan examination hearings. Obviously, there's quite a large employment area to the north of the railway, and is site EMP1 that's a sort of a rolling forward of an existing 2017 local plan site?
Yes, sir, that's correct. It's EMP1 brackets 2.
Which then brings us to the one single residential allocation at site 295. Before we look at the detail of site 295, are there any further submissions in relation to the overall approach for Marden in policy LPR 6E? No, I mean, I think the reference to the river belt and the action, securing the action plan, was it excuse me? Yes, the action plan objectives would be a main modification for the avoidance of doubt. So if we can turn to site 295, this is the land at Copper Lane and Albion Road. Again, if I can, in the usual style, invite the council first to just explain why they consider that the proposed allocation and the policy framework for this site is justified and effective. Obviously, there are various representations before me in terms of concern about impact on the landscape and the highway network and biodiversity. So if I can hear from the council, I understand there's potentially a proposed change to the policies map in relation to the extent of this site. Is it who's going to start on this?
Apologies, sir. I was looking to see if anybody was going to jump in before me. As my colleague explained, this site came in originally as two separate adjacent sites as part of the call for sites process. The site promoters then combined the two sites together. We've had a series of pre-application discussions with the promoters. In contrast to this morning's discussions about Coxheath, we've also had conversation or meetings with both parish and borough members on this site to seek agreement on the quantum and form of development. So there's been advanced discussions with both officers and members on the site. We are comfortable with the approximate number within the site. I have seen pre-application drawings that show a slight increase above that, I think, to reflect the applicants or the promoters' preferred figures. I think whether it's approximately 110 or another figure would be better left to the development management process in order to allow for LVIA, ecology and other sort of environmental reports to sort of support that assessment. But it's a site that, although it's open countryside, it's sloping, so it has some visual sensitivities. The promoters have carried out a significant amount of testing to support the allocation, and we are therefore comfortable that adequate mitigation can be incorporated to address those potential concerns. It is in effect, as my colleague explained, an extension of a 2017 site. There is no vehicular connectivity between the two, but we will be exploring the scope for pedestrian connectivity, which may assist in addressing KCC's comments about footway and cycle connections as well.
Thank you for that. And in terms of potential proposed modifications to this policy, so inelegantly pick up my other folder. The Council has put forward a proposed additional criterion for this policy that it should provide an ecological impact assessment to take account of the biodiversity present. Does the Council able to just briefly explain why that may be necessary, particularly in relation to this site?
As part of the Reg 18 to Reg 19 review that I explained yesterday, so we obviously further engaged with consultees and looked at other issues. The site is principally orchard, but at the southern part of the site, because of the topography and the natural drainage, there are a series of ponded areas towards the bottom of the site. So I think the view was that whilst they don't appear under threat in any of the pre-application schemes that we've seen, we felt that it would be helpful for the ultimate layout of the site to be informed by, for example, landscape and ecological appraisals, which would be a typical requirement of most of these site allocations anyway. So,
thank you. I'll bring in Ryden Holmes. I think your view is this is something that could be covered by other policies. There's no need for a specific reference.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. I think it can be covered by other policies, and probably already is covered by other policies. However, if you are minded to accept the modification, it doesn't cause us any problems. We've looked, as you've just heard explained, in a great deal of detail already with the site in terms of ecology and the impacts that the scheme would have, and we're not intending to build in those sensitive areas that have been alluded to. And I think there's been reference to, in some of the representations as well, to turtle doves and the importance of that species. They don't, or their habitat is largely hedgerow. We're keeping the hedgerows around the boundaries of the site, adding native hedgerows within the site. The orchard facility is not one that is a habitat that they utilise. So in all respects, we're confident that the scheme can progress, and the ecological work's already well underway and would be part of the planning application. So we don't have a strong view if you want to, or the council want to include that as a modification, just to include that, although I think it would be covered anyway as part of a planning application.
Thank you. And in terms of other representations I have before me in relation to this site, obviously I have submissions from Kent County Council in their highway authority capacity. They are saying, or their advice is for soundness, that there should be further policy content on this site in terms of the kind of connectivity into Marden via Albion Road. I don't know if the council's had an opportunity to reflect on Kent County Council's comments. I'm mindful that the policy already requires suitable vehicular access and the creation of safe pedestrian connections, because I don't think there is at present a continuous pedestrian footway from this site, or where the site would connect to Albion Road through to the centre of the village. I think there is from the new housing development, but that presumably need to be extended a bit further.
Sir, to extend the pedestrian connectivity to this particular site entrance, rather than, for example, through the site to the north, would probably require a traffic order in terms of removing an element of on-street parking. I don't think we would want the policy criterion to predetermine that, because obviously the traffic order will be the subject of its own separate consultation process. I think a general expectation that connections will be improved is is appropriate, but I wouldn't want the site allocation policy to come forward with a specific measure that hasn't yet been tested through consultation with residents. The terraced properties opposite rely upon that on-street parking. It's their only parking.
Thank you. And in terms of relationship to the housing development to the north, was that a Ryden Homes scheme? No. I mean, is the potential for kind of connecting the two sites? Is that unfortunately not available?
So there is no scope for vehicle connection between the two. That is something that we explored at an early stage to avoid the need for a separate access. But as always with schemes, we seek to negotiate potential connections. So there are elements of the design of the scheme to the north, particularly at the rear of the site, where it would be possible through agreement with landowners to secure a connection, but that is obviously something we would be encouraging the current promoters to engage with their neighbours at the planning application stage to see what could be achieved.
And then finally, for the council in relation to this site, there's a proposed amendment again in document SUB 11 in terms of the boundary for this site. I don't know if the council could just briefly outline why that may be necessary and potentially necessary to include in a schedule of policy map amendments.
I think so. As it sets out in sub 11, it was just to amend the boundary slightly to remove a field to the east of Thorn Road and west of the site allocation.
Our intention here, sir, is to ensure that the boundary of Marden is kept to a minimum. In effect, we are extending the boundary to incorporate this site, which we commend to you, but there was potential to incorporate a greater area of land than was actually necessary to the Marden boundary, hence the modification to the policies map, simply just to go round the site boundary.
I see, so it kind of reflects features on the ground in terms of sort of site boundaries.
Exactly, sir.
Thank you. I don't know if Mr. Rayner, as on behalf of your client, whether you've seen that proposed policy map change, whether that's something that's just a factual.
That's acceptable. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Thank you. I think as I've previously intimated, I can't recommend changes to the policies map, but that's something the council can do, and I think when we get to a point of main modification consultation, there should be a separate schedule of proposed changes to the policies map so that people are aware where those are likely to be. In terms of the principle of this location, it obviously is on the southern edge of Marden. I've visited the site, been able to obviously look at it from within Thorn Road, Albion Road and Copper Lane. Before I get on to kind of matters of site delivery and capacity, in terms of the principle of this site, mindful obviously CPRE Kent are with us today. Was there anything further you wish to say in relation to this particular site and the council's approach for Marden, Ms Davis?
Nothing specific in that regard, although we did want to welcome the fact that they acknowledged the level of growth that has taken place since the 2017 plan, and our comments were more related to the infrastructure and the perception of local residents that when a development takes place, the infrastructure takes a while to catch up. But we are reassured by the cross-referencing to the infrastructure development plan, so I haven't got anything specific to raise.
Thank you. Yes, that's a helpful reminder. Mr. Davis, it's in the council's statement, I think, on the matter 7. Is that correct? That there could be further policy content in relation to Marden? I'm now getting confused between the various rural service centres. Yes, it's in relation to my matters issue question 718. I think the council's suggesting a further criterion about improvements to the gas main as per the infrastructure delivery plan.
Yes, so I believe that we'll be looking for a modification in that regard to ensure that, presumably in response to a representation from Southern Gas Networks as part of our consultations.
I'm sort of looking at the council's proposed wording. I mean, as a reflection of what's already in the infrastructure, I mean, delivery plan. I mean, it seems to be possibly a matter of kind of fact or intention that these works. I assume Marden is already on the gas network, and this is kind of improvements to it. I mean, my initial reaction is that's a change the council can make without me necessarily having to recommend it for plan soundness.
Thank you, sir.
And then finally, in relation to site 295, it's shown as in the plan as a capacity of approximately 113 dwellings. In regard to the council's evidence in the Schlar and elsewhere, is that justified? And what's the council thinking in terms of the anticipated delivery on this site in terms of where it's likely to come forward in the plan period?
So in terms of, my colleague will confirm the trajectories. In terms of the site capacity, I think I've sort of covered this prematurely already, but having been through pre-application on the site and consulted with various parties such as Kent County Council's ecology team and our own landscape officers, I think I used the phrase, we're comfortable at 113, and it may be possible that that can be increased, but we would want that to be subject to further testing such as LVIA. Obviously the quality of any built design will be fundamental to capacity, the nature of the open spaces, but having tested the scheme against open space requirements, 113 is a comfortable figure, and it may be possible through good design to optimise that further.
Thank you. In terms of delivery, Ms. Smith?
Yes, just in terms of the trajectory, we've modelled it to start delivering in 2025-26, over 3 years.
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Rayner, on behalf of your client, whether you kind of chime or align with the capacity and likely delivery.
Yeah, we're happy with both those things. I mean, capacity-wise, we're comfortable if you're putting the figure as an approximate figure to be 113. We think we can do slightly more than that, and we're certainly, as has been alluded to, there's been pre-app discussions on around 124, but we're comfortable with that, and that would be correctly tested through a planning application. And in terms of delivery, we too have we're well advanced, first of all, in terms of the work we've already done, and we also have 2025 as our aim for first completion.
Thank you. Are there any further submissions people wish to make in relation to site 295? No. Okay, in which case I'll bring this short session on Marden to a close. That concludes this morning's hearing session, so thank you everybody for your contributions. We resume, I think, at 2 o'clock this afternoon for Headcorn, and that'll be our final hearing session this week. So I'll see the council, no doubt, in about an hour and 3/4 back in this room. Thank you.